We will get started roughly in about 1 minute. All right, I think we have a good amount of people in. Good afternoon and welcome to Gray Associates Masterclass on Integrated Program Evaluation and Management. This year's class is all new except for this course, which will be a review of last year's course as well. A few housekeeping items to just get taken care of it first. Raise your hand or just put something in the chat if you have a question. Given the nature of this, we are more than happy to probably interrupt Bob and get him to answer your questions in real time because we always love audience participation, especially in this educational setting. If you don't feel like doing that, put your questions in Q&A. It allows other people to upvote them, and we can make sure we get to them in the appropriate time. If we can't get to all of them, we will be sure to follow up afterwards. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our CEO, Bob Atkins.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me this afternoon to talk about integrated program evaluation and management. This is a very narrow concept, if you will, but the implications of making good program decisions ripple out through the university and its cost structure, what you teach, what skills students learn, what they can get jobs for, and ultimately into influencing what kind of citizens they'll be in society. So while it may seem arcane and at times very analytic, I believe it's incredibly important, not just to the university itself, but to your students and to those in the communities around you. So let's walk through a very high level view. Well, it's not very high level. Most of you will probably think it's very detailed, but a view of how we think you should do this so that you bring in the right information. And I will say up front, the information doesn't give you your program choices on a platter. You still need to use your judgment. So this is not strictly a numeric exercise. That's why we refer to it as data informed. You can use the information to make the decisions, but it's not data driven. There's no algorithm that will tell you what programs to offer. At least we haven't made one yet. So we're working on it, but I don't see us getting there anytime in the next 5 or 10 years. And even if we did, I don't think any university would accept it. So as we'll talk about, there's more to it than the numbers, both in terms of the thought process, but also importantly, in terms of the participants and decision-making process that's required for program evaluation management to be effective. So let's take a look at what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about why we're here. What's the challenge, the swamp we're trying to drain? Then we'll talk about how to evaluate market demand. We'll go on from there to look at program economics and benchmarking so you can understand not just whether the market wants the program, but does it make money or not? And then we'll take a look at the decision-making process that is effective. And finally, we'll talk about how to look at the portfolio as a whole. Now, the challenge, as we get into it, the first challenge is that knowledge is growing faster than budgets. And all of you experience this in your own fields. The rate at which we're generating new information is really staggering. Now, you could look at it quantitatively and just look at the volume of data. That's doubling now about every 6 months. That's not really knowledge, though. That's just bits and bytes. If you take a much more conservative view, you'd say that knowledge is growing about 4 to 5% a year. And you know, there's no inflation in that number. And that's based on the volume of US patents changing year over year. So that's probably a conservative estimate, but it is certainly growing faster than the funding for most institutions. And that creates this fundamental problem. It's not your fault. You feel like there's more to be taught, and there is. But we've got to find a way to do that within the resources at the institution. So that's a prioritization process. And that's where we would suggest bring in the best data you can, but also include the judgment of your peers. Now, one of the other problems is that everybody has their favorite program. You know, some of these are literally taken from client experience. You know, a local employer thought that a school should, you know, train welders. Another school had a trustee who felt they should have a motorcycle program, even though the average motorcycle technician is paid $9.50 an hour and couldn't repay back their student loans in a lifetime. Obviously, with the emergence of cannabis, you've got people talking about that, including us. Going to be a huge field. Quantum computing will be huge. Exactly when is a different question, but it certainly will be in terms of software writing. So when you're sitting there as provost, you've got this problem that every one of these constituencies may feel strongly at an emotional level about the program, but emotions aren't going to optimize your curriculum. They're also not necessarily going to deliver programs that can help support the rest of the institution financially. So it's not that you should ignore them, but you have to think through and have a methodology for figuring out which of these is a good idea. So how do you do that? Well, we would suggest you have to look at 4 variables: mission, academic standards, markets, and margins. And as I've mentioned, the process that you wrap around that is also very important. You've got to involve the right people. That includes the president of the university down through the deans of your academic programs. And from time to time, we have senior academics participate in this process as well, senior faculty, I should say. So you've got to also have a good process where they can participate and be heard and yet arrive at a conclusion in a timely way. Now, why timely? Well, first, let's dispel it with a myth that academic institutions are intrinsically slow. That is not my experience. And if you think you're slow, I would like to introduce you to some of my old Fortune 500 clients, and you can talk with them about how long it took them to change their businesses. I'll give you a spoiler alert. Some of them are no longer in business because they didn't change. So, you know, you're not alone in having difficulty making change. It is a hard process. And, you know, you've got to have the right people, because otherwise what you'll get is fundamentally organ rejection. You make your choices and everybody says no. And that's natural in most institutions. And you want to avoid that by getting them in up front, really getting your thoughts and working through what the right choices are. And then turning that into recommendations that can go through the approval process and up to the board. But you do have to be able to do that quickly. The market now is starting to move more like a commercial market. You've got very large, well-funded competitors, especially online, who are launching programs and turning programs off at a pace that we haven't seen before in higher education. So if you want to get in when the market opportunity is best, you've got to move fairly quickly. So I wouldn't say that you can jump ahead or jump past the academic review process in the faculty senate, but I would say it's worth looking at what they need to understand to make a decision, and make sure that you work with them to find a way to do that quickly. It's not that you're going to skip steps, you're just going to find a way to put them together and do it quickly. And we'll talk about some of those ways. Now, when we look at markets, there are 4 factors we think are important. And if there are any others throughout this process, if you have an idea of something else we should be looking at, please let us know. If there's other data we should be looking at, please let us know. We're always looking for new information sources and things we've missed. So as I say, it really is welcome. Put it in the chat, shoot me an email, and we will, promise me we won't ignore it. Student demand is the first thing. What do students want? And we'll talk about data sources for that. Employment. How many jobs are out there? What skills are required? Who's hiring? Is it growing? Is it falling? Competitive intensity. Is this field already saturated? Is there room for another competitor? Are you one of the competitors in there? Can you grow your program? Or when you look at the competition and see how many people are coming through, are you already doing as well as you could reasonably expect? And finally, degree fit. And that is, what level, degree level is this program? And is that an appropriate degree level for you? So we don't want to give PhDs in house painting. And we also don't want to give associate's degrees in neurosurgery. So you've got to look at that and decide what's the appropriate degree level and does that fit your campus. So we're not going to see community colleges wanting to do doctoral programs, and we're not going to see 4-year colleges generally wanting to do associate's programs. So that's what that degree fit is about. Now let's take a look at the dimension of market demand and understand a little bit about how to evaluate that. We believe that there's 3 broad stages in this, and think of this as a flow in time. The most current thing you can see is what students are searching for on Google and other platforms. And we can pull that data once a month. You can get it very frequently as well. But that gives you information about, by program, literally what are students searching for, and you can't see where they click to, but you can definitely see what they were looking for. The next piece of data we think is important is what they actually enrolled in. Now recognize this is already a little bit backwards looking. It only updates once every 3 months, 3 times a year, but it's still very good information. It's very current, and it tells you what students are actually enrolling in the prior quarter or so. Now, the oldest, but probably the most complete data source is iPads. That tells you what students graduated in or what they completed. And you can count up completions by program and by institution. So it's an incredibly rich data set. It can tell you a lot about who your competition is. It can tell you about growth in programs. It can tell you about overall size of a program. But remember, growth trends that you see in iPads are the result of decisions that students made 5 or 6 years ago, depending on the program. So it's very old information about trends and what students want. Why is that? Well, the most current version of iPads is 2020. And so that's graduates in June of 2020. So right out of the chute, we're a year and a half old. But they didn't make their decision of what program to take in 2020. They made that way back when they picked their major, sophomore year, for example, in a 4-year college. So if they're going through in 6 years, you're looking at a decision that was made 4 years before 2020. So a decision all the way back in 2016. So in terms of trends, iPads is very old. In terms of overall information about the industry, it's quite good. It's very comprehensive. Enrollment, as I mentioned, much more current, and that is also very robust. And our search volumes now, we're able to cover 1,000 programs. It's not everything, but it's 90% of all completions. So are in those programs. So it's pretty robust. And the difficulty with that is just you can't necessarily know that if they search for this, they actually enrolled in it later. But it does give you a sense of where interest is and how it's trending. That's very current. So let's take a look at some actual enrollment figures, and we'll be going through both the theory and a little bit of data as we walk through this presentation. So here's an example of real data. Most of you are familiar with this, but there's been a sharp decline in higher ed in the last few years. COVID is certainly a cause. Demographics are also a cause. And I think a little bit of a failure on the part of higher education to effectively articulate its value proposition is a cause. There's a lot. I was just on a radio show last night. They were talking about how people ought to become welders and auto mechanics and so forth, and that really they would earn just as much. They will not earn just as much. A college graduate earns $26,000 more than the average tradesman, the average welder in particular. A history major makes twice as much as a welder. So, there's mythology around the value of college right now, and it's not in our favor. So we've got to do more to articulate the value that we really do create in our society. Now, that growth is not evenly distributed. So we actually do have whole degree levels that are growing. Postmaster certificates are up about 1%. Master's degrees are slightly positive. And then things start to fall off. Doctoral is still pretty level, but look at associate's degrees down at the bottom, and that really explains a lot of the difficulties that community colleges are facing. That's a 10% year-over-year decline in associate degree enrollment. So big problem there. People who haven't declared their major are also down 8 or 10%. Bachelor's degrees down a solid 3%. Undergraduate certificates also down about 3%. And finally, post-baccalaureate certificates down 3%. So really, we're looking at something that in most degree levels is +1 to -3%, with associate's degrees really falling sharply, down 10%. What's big out there? So most of this you probably know, you've experienced it on your own campus, but business administration is the largest program in the United States in terms of enrollment, with close to 670,000 students in it as of fall 2021. Registered nursing is in behind that, but it's still 50% behind. There's sort of a group here of psychology and registered nursing at about 450,000 students enrolled. General studies is right behind that, if you can call that a major. And then we have biology, biological studies, and computer science. And then there's quite a sharp fall off from 300,000 enrolled to under 200,000 enrolled. And there we have an interesting array of programs: criminal justice, liberal arts and studies, go liberal arts majors. I am one of them, and continue to try and support the value of liberal arts. Mechanical engineering, not a surprise. Accounting, also not a surprise. Finance is a bit surprising to be on this list, honestly, to me. That's a pretty niche-y kind of program and form of thought. but it is still one of the top 10 programs in the United States in terms of total graduates. And then you get to a little bit of a trades-like program, marketing management, particular skill, political science. I think it could take over as a dismal science these days. Like, economics might have to pass on that hat. Kinesiology and exercise science, and elementary education and liberal arts coming through there at the bottom. So interesting array of programs from healthcare and nursing, business administration, computer science, a little bit of justice in there, and some accounting. Now, what's growing within that mix? And we've got two metrics here. The first is the change in the number of enrolled students. That is the unit change in growth. And the second you see on the far right is the percent change in growth. So I was a little surprised here to see general studies, that's the non-major, up almost 11,000 students. So there are more people out there deferring their choice of a specific major or coming into a school trying to do degree completion in a general studies program. Computer science is second in terms of growth. Both of these are very large programs though, so the percentage growth is relatively modest at 3%. Then we get a program that's not as big in terms of unit growth, but up 60% experimental psychology. And another psychology program right behind it up 19%. And I think what you're seeing, and by the way, a little bit further down, behavioral sciences, which is a flavor of psychology as well. I think you're seeing a concern here with mental health that, as far as I can tell, is a well-earned concern. And I think one that we're not effectively addressing as a society yet. So a lot of people interested in this. I hope that turns into people who can help folks with the various psychological maladies we're suffering coming out of first pandemic and now a major war. So there's a lot to be concerned about these days. You see finance growing. I talked about behavioral sciences. Health here is the next one. And if you really want to synthesize what's growing in this whole area in higher education, it's not complicated. What you're seeing, it's health and computer science, and health and more broadly technology, but almost all computer related. And here you see a stack of those. Cybersecurity, not a surprise, data science, a flavor, if you will. And let's see, there's one other on here. So those are some of the big areas you've got to, computer engineering that you've got to keep track of. But marketing makes the list, teacher education does, econometrics. I should come back here and note that electrical engineering is up staggering 1,500%. So we'll go check again to make sure that when I see that kind of growth rate, it always makes me nervous that the data is incorrect. One other to highlight here in terms of percentage growth is data science, 186% increase. Now recall that as a zip code, that didn't even exist 2 or 3 years ago. So we grouped that to create a zip code. We're putting together things around business analytics and so forth that came together as data science. But that, I think all of you are feeling that. That's growing very, very fast. And I think it will continue to grow for some time. Liberal arts is even growing down here at the bottom, and engineering last with 3% percentage growth.
Question, do you think general studies programs is something students seek out at the start, or is it a catch-all towards the end of their college career?
Pretty sure nobody seeks it out. And that's a very important point when you think about student demand. Conceptually, there are two kinds of ways students manifest their demand. One is they come looking for a program, and then they look across the schools to see which schools offer that program. So, but it's program first search. The second way they look for colleges is by brand. I know I want to go to an Ivy League college. I know I want to go to a state school. I know I want to go to the state school in my state, in which case I'm looking by brand name for those schools. When you come in on the brand side, you're very likely to end up in something like general studies, at least for your first year. And remember, this is enrollment, so it's counting students, through all 4 years. So you could be picked up as a general studies student at the very beginning, and flip side, you could be picked up at the end when you haven't fulfilled all your requirements for your major, but you fulfilled all the requirements to graduate, so you graduate in general studies. I also mentioned that the adult learner who's got some credits may want to come in and complete in general studies in order to get their degree. So there are a lot of different ways to end up in that program. Yeah, it is absolutely possible that general studies are the first years being admitted to the program. That's absolutely correct. So just because it's enrollment, it includes people in all 4 years. And therefore, some of them are going to be in general studies until they declare a major. There's a comment about political science and economics. No, they're not going to replace each other. I was actually joking that economics has been called the, what's the phrase for it? The dismal science. And I was proposing that it perhaps could lose that crown as the dismal science to political science, given our recent history. But I probably shouldn't be making political jokes on this. I hope that it wasn't directed at any one party. Let me put it that way. It all seems pretty dismal these days.
We got 2 more questions real quick. Do you think that general studies is people coming back to complete a degree with whatever course they were doing from the beginning?
Yeah, it could be any of those things. I mentioned, it's first years who haven't decided yet. It's adult learners coming back that want to finish up their degree. It's a bit of a catch-all analytically, just as it is a catch-all for students who have a bunch of credits and want to graduate. But they have.
The next question is there data regarding the success of general studies majors on the job market? I'd like to know more about this when we discuss data related to employment.
I don't think we have general studies in there, although I'll check. I have data on some other programs where people are always saying that there are no jobs for graduates. And Monica, if you could look at our data from ACS, the American Community Survey, tracks what people ask for, what undergraduate major the people had, and the actual career they have and how much money they're earning. And that's one of the things we'll talk about as being a very important source of data about what people really do. Surprisingly enough, you'll find that most of the data you get is what people think people should do. And as you know, people don't always do what they should do. In fact, very few do what they should do when it comes to what they do after graduation. So if you could look that up, Monica, I'm not sure if you have general studies in that database or not, but one of my colleagues will check, and if we have it, we'll let you know. So why do we care about student demand? Well, one of the reasons, not the only one, is that student demand is highly predictive of program size and profitability. So if you need to launch a program that is going to improve the margins of the institution, help you grow, help to satisfy your budgets without making headcount cuts, you have to look for programs where the student demand is strong. And for those of you who aren't statisticians, the left-hand side is a scatter plot of programs by student demand score and the margin on those programs. So the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is the student demand score from our systems, and the y-axis or vertical axis is the margin on those programs. And you can see the pattern is clearly going up, and the R-squared, or the reliability of that prediction, is 0.51. Perfectly reliable is 1.0, unreliable is 0, and it's actually quite unusual to see a single variable analysis like this and have it have a predicted value as high as 0.51. Normally for a single variable, you're going to see numbers like those on the right for employment. If it's a pretty strong variable, you'll be in the below 10%. So here we see employment also predicts student enrollment, 8.4%, and contribution, which by the way is highly correlated with enrollment. Competition also about an 8 or 9%. And if you mix all those, by the way, you don't get an improvement. It actually degrades the forecast. So student demand is really the #1 thing if you're trying to understand which programs are likely to drive margin in the institution.
Real quickly, we have a question. Are these charts, the charts you were just on, available in PES Plus? I believe we created them ourselves.
These are brand new. This data will be available in PES Plus this month. Which day this month remains to be seen, but we're updating the system so that instead of the data that you've traditionally had in PES Plus on inquiry volumes, we're going to substitute in the data on enrollment. We believe that's a very significant upgrade in the quality of the data. The enrollment data is comprehensive, it's current, and our inquiry data was getting increasingly squirrely over time. And so we felt it was important to replace that with a better data set. So now you'll have over 1,000 programs with Google search volume. Before there were only 200. Then you'll have enrollment data in there from which you could pull this as soon as we get it rolled out in our new update. And then you'll have iPads. So it's a very robust sort of walk through the funnel of the student experience. I hope that answers your questions. The graphs, so those specific graphs do not yet exist, but it's a very interesting request and a pretty easy thing for us to do. So if somebody could just take a note, we could have this chart in PES very, very quickly. Let's see. So I'm going to keep going because I don't want to get too far behind time. In terms of search volume, we're looking at this here by 2-digit zip. That's aggregated, so a 6-digit zip, very detailed. That would be RN to BSN in nursing, 2-digit, which would be nursing, a 4-digit, which would be nursing, and a 2-digit, which is health professions. So that's how it stacks up. And you can see in terms of search volume, health professions are really way ahead of double anything else. And I think that reflects the period we've just gone through in part. We also certainly have a shortage of every kind of healthcare provider following COVID. And because it's a group that was aging in any case and thinking of retiring, and we have a bunch of regulatory constraints that prevent us from graduating more healthcare professionals. So I'm hoping that some of the boards of nursing and others decide to let us all have more seats, at least those of us who can get a nurse through and have her pass the NCLEX. But I don't know if they'll adapt and really help us drive the enrollment we need and the graduates we need in many of these health professions. Business and marketing is second. Culinary is third. I hope, we'll all be back eating at restaurants soon. Education is fourth. Then you get to visual performing arts, computers, legal, these are all the big categories, and it helps to give you a sense of the relative size. So business is second to health by about 50%. Culinary is about 50% smaller than business. Education is a drop, again, of about 50%. Then we get visual and performing arts, about even with education. Then another big drop down to 1.1 million, computer and information sciences and legal. And then a series down around 1 million, transportation, engineering, and public and social services. Now, if we look at the 2-digit zips and say what's growing, the list changes quite a lot. And we see multi-interdisciplinary studies up 22%, business up 15, legal up 13, physical sciences up 12, and you can read down the chart. Liberal arts is still pulling its weight and actually growing. And I'll pick out English language and literature, up 10%. And this is really a surprise to me, but I've seen it now in several different data sets. So here we're seeing growth in foreign languages. And it's the first time I've seen growth in foreign languages since I've been doing data here. I shouldn't say that because there's one other place. If you look on Coursera and Udemy, Coursera in particular, you'll find that their foreign language programs are large and growing. So after years of decline, there's finally a little bit of interest in languages. And I find that very encouraging. It was a subject of interest to me. I used to be able to read and speak, I guess 3, sort of. I don't know if any native speaker would have recognized my speaking their language, but I think it's important in terms of understanding other cultures. And we should advocate for it because it's also good for neuroplasticity and neurogeneration. It's good for your brain.
Bob, real quick,
yeah.
We have a question. The enrollment data, does that only include bachelor's?
This is bachelor's. We will have it for all degree levels, but we couldn't display it all today. So the data we're showing is bachelor's only. That's not a constraint of the data supplier. It's just what we have time to share. Now, when we look at those numbers, those are all national numbers, but very few colleges really compete nationwide. Even the Ivies, they're East Coast and Stanford, sort of an equivalent Ivy, don't really draw evenly across the country, despite very, very powerful brands. So you really need to look, us normal mortals need to look at their local market and be able to define that. And what you see here is a methodology we use for market definition. We'll take your student addresses, populate a map, we happen to do it in Tactician, and then have a look to see where the majority of your students come from. And then the definition of your market will be a circle, a radius, if you will, that you swing around your campus that includes the preponderance of your students. A little bit of judgment calls to exactly what percentage. But the other thing about the data is, in any reasonable program, including ours, if it's not really a circle, if you have to stop at a border, for example, one of our clients recently said, even though it's only 50 miles away, we never get any students from Kentucky. So we cut Kentucky out, even though it was within 100 miles. And you really have to be able to do that because silly things like rivers can have a dramatic impact on the probability of enrollment in a college. So And if you have a river and a state border, you'd think that there were guards on the bridge. It's usually a 50% drop off in the probability of a student enrolling. So you do need to be able to make those adjustments in defining your market. As you do that, you're going to end up with a chart that looks somewhat like this, where you can see what number of students are coming by distance. So for example, in this disguised example, 2,600 students were coming from within 5 miles, which is really striking if you think about it, but not unusual. 5 to 10, we're up to 50% of the students. And as you get out to 25, in this case, we've got 90% of the students within 25 miles. So it makes sense to draw a 25-mile radius around this campus, because if we went up to 50, we'd only pick up 1 or 2 more percent. But you pick up a lot of extraneous data on competitors that you don't really compete against, on jobs that are not really available to your students, and so forth. So you want to keep that initial market definition pretty tight so that you know you're looking at the market you really preponderantly serve. Now, when we're doing this with clients, that's not the only market you want to look at. You'll want to look at your region. You might want to look at the country as well, especially for online. But my personal view is that if the program decision doesn't work in your local market, it's very unlikely you're going to get saved by a broader marketplace. You really need things that are going to do well, given the students that are available to you in your local market. And then everything else is gravy. Not that it doesn't matter, but your decision can't be dependent on being successful in areas where currently you're really not drawing any students. So that's a little bit of why we do this. And it's important overall that the market data you get is for the market you actually serve. So let's shift over now and start to look at some real program data at the national level. And again, we're filtered for bachelors here. The program, our software has a filter for associates, for graduate. That's not a problem. We're only picking bachelors as a convenience to have a coherent set of data for you today. And the same analysis works equally well at the associates or community college level. We've worked there a lot. So I want to reinforce that this approach works for every degree level. Today, we're going to focus on bachelors, but that's not to say it couldn't just as easily apply elsewhere. So what you will find when you score programs on student demand, competition, employment, and degree fit is nursing will almost always be the #1 program. I have seen it drift down as far as #3 in a few markets, but seldom seen it below that. There's very strong student demand for nursing. The competition is manageable. There are a lot of competitors, but the market is still not saturated. There's still more people looking for a program than there are seats in nursing. And finally, employment opportunities are large and generally pretty well paid. And that pay is going up quite quickly now because of the shortage. Mechanical engineering happens to come out second on this list. Very similar profile. In order to get at the top of this list, you have to be pretty much good at everything. And I should pause and just talk about colors and percentiles here, because that's not natural for everybody. The colors are set based on the underlying percentile for that particular variable. So in this case, we're looking at scores as a variable. Dark green means you're in the 98th to 100th percentile. The lighter green is 98th, a little bit below that, and even lighter green is 95th, 90th, and so forth, down to the bright pinks that are below 40%. So to make all that simple, dark green is good, pink is bad, and everything in between is in between. And that way you can look at a chart like this and immediately see which programs do well on each criterion. And that's very helpful when you're trying to scan through a lot of programs, and also very helpful for those of us who would prefer not to inspect, what is this page, 60 numbers, 80 numbers on a page. I have colleagues who enjoy that, not me. So for me, the color coding makes it much more accessible. And we do put the numbers in there specifically, by the way, for folks who have issues with color differentiation. So you do have to have both if you're going to create charts like this, because obviously there are people who can't see green. Now, that is not enough data on which to base a program decision. So let's begin to look at the individual components of market analysis. We're going to start with student demand, and we're going to use a bachelor's degree in finance as our example here. And now I'm going to work down this chart over on the right. And in this example, we still have inquiries because our database isn't going to shift over to enrollment until later in the month. And we can see at this point, there's 616 inquiries, And you might well ask yourself, well, is that a lot or little? I actually had a client ask me that once, to my embarrassment. And, of course, you can't really know what is a lot or little in a given market unless you can see other programs to see how they do. And that's why we developed the percentiles, because the percentile tells you how this program ranks versus 1,400 other programs we keep track of. And that's all calculated in the local market that you would serve. So that combination of a numeric answer and a percentile really helps you to interpret the data. And then, of course, the color coding makes it even easier. You can see in this particular program, almost all our student demand indicators in terms of program size are green or dark green. So they're 95th percentile or higher. One exception, Google search volumes are only at the 70th percentile. That would give me a little bit of pause. It doesn't mean it's a bad program, but it does mean it's a very reliable data source. Would give me a little pause that it may not be as big as we sometimes think it is, or at least the student demand right now might not be as big as we would hope. But let's start to look at change in search volumes. Inquiries are up. Google search is actually up very substantially at the 72nd percentile, so above average. Completion volumes are up at the 96th percentile, up by 51. Inquiry volumes are up enormously, but that's one of the reasons we got rid of that data. It tends to be very volatile, which doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. And the Google search year-over-year change is up on a percentage basis by 9%. Completion volumes up 5%. So if I were looking at this is about as good as it gets in terms of student demand. And to the extent that there's any risk in the Google search volume, only being at the 70th percentile, I think that's largely offset by the fact it's growing at 9%. So it will become larger over time relative to other programs. And we don't do this for fun, right? So you sit there and look at that and you say, okay, well, so what? And the implication for this, one-dimensional now, it's not an answer, it's just one dimension. The student demand would suggest that there's room to start this program if you don't have it, or to grow it if you do have it. Now let's take a look at some raw data on, because I'm going to switch over here to looking at employment next. But in order to look at the employment data, you have to understand what it is and what it isn't. And the first problem you'll run into is what's called a crosswalk. And I've got to admit, this is kind of an arcane subject. I don't know if any of you have ever done a crosswalk. I didn't really even know what one was 10 years ago. But we have to go from academic programs, what are called SIPs, Classification of Instructional Programs, which is the way the federal government counts enrollment in a program, to SOCs, Standard Occupation Codes. And if you need a mnemonic for that, it's SIP-SOC, SIP-SOC. It sounds like somebody walking in the mud. But there is no linear relationship between SIPs and SOCs, though there are those who presume or believe that there should be. One of those who believes that there should be a linear relationship is the National Center for Education Statistics, the federal government. Many people use that crosswalk. And that crosswalk is predicated on the belief that people go into or should go into or are prepared only for the field for which they've been immediately educated. So if I study nursing, I should become a nurse. That's direct prep. Now, there's a little catch here. You see the quote on the left-hand side. This is directly off the NCAS crosswalk, this particular quote. And I'm going to read it out loud because it was unbelievable. When I was actually writing my book and I went to verify the crosswalk and I read this paragraph and I just couldn't believe it. The NCS SIP-SOC crosswalk is not based on actual empirical data. That is kind of a shocker. It is based on the opinions of labor market economists about what somebody with a given degree is prepared to do. Now let's take a look at reality. It's a little bit of a confusing chart here, but I worked on it for hours, literally trying to make it clear, and I'm not sure I did. The bottom of this chart is the percentage of graduates who actually go into direct prep fields. So if you're in this column, only 20% of your graduates are going into direct prep. If you're over here, 80% of your graduates are going into direct prep. So if direct prep were perfectly true, all my programs would be over here in this 80 to 100% column. Now let's just take a look and see if that's true. Well, we only have 1,061 programs. Of those programs, one program actually had 80 to 100% direct placement. Now it's, but there are more in the next column. Well, we get all the way up to 14 out of 1,000. And in the 14 column, we have 60 to 80% of my graduates. And, I go over and okay, well, does more than half? Well, actually, no, you only pick up another 27, going all the way down to 40%. 80% of your programs, actually more like 90, have fewer than 20% of their graduates going to fields for which they're directly prepared. Let me just say that one more time. 90% of programs, fewer than 20% of their graduates go into fields for which they're direct prepared.
Bob, do you want to let him guess what the one program is?
Yeah. Anybody know?
Too late. Monica
Oh,
already gave it away.
Monica. Monica, did you give that away?
Oops.
I'm not going to invite you back. So yeah, it is nursing, everybody. It is probably the poster child for direct preparation. 82% of people who study nursing go on into nursing. Who graduate from a nursing program go on into nursing. And of course, the other 8%, a lot of them are people who didn't pass the NCLEX. So it's not that they wouldn't have gone into nursing, but they couldn't go into nursing. NCLEX is the exam nurses have to take in order to become a nurse. So let's take a look and see just how off this can be. And I'm going to rattle through the next few charts. They tell a similar story, but history majors are, according to NCLEX, go into 5 fields. They can become tour guides and escorts. Now, I want to be careful here. I am a history major. That is not that kind of escort. This is somebody who shows you around a museum or something. They also go into managers, all other, my personal favorite, we can get classified as other. Historians, there might be 2 or 3 jobs a year in that field. History teachers, post-secondary and secondary school teachers, except for special and career technical education. So that's it. If you're a history major, NCS says you can go into one of these 5 fields. Now, what do we actually do? Well, it's kind of different. On the left hand, you can see the number of SIPs. That's history. It's 1 SIP. Then you can see the NCES match SOCs. There are 5, as we just discussed. And over here, we have the actual employment by SOC or by occupation. And we find out that, oh, geez, they didn't go into, history majors don't go into 4 fields. They go into 502 fields. Now, by the way, that's 498, not 398 difference. Now, when you're doing the kind of work we do and trying to align programs, jobs, and look at a marketplace and understand student demand, if you're off by 5 or 10%, honestly, you're doing really well. This is like horseshoes and hand grenades. Close is good. Being off by a multiple of 100, that is not good. So keep that in mind. This is really about as wrong as you can get and still be on the same planet. And the other thing that's interesting here is for all the talk about history majors and the impending poverty that they're going to experience, on average, they actually earn $106,000, and they're in the 80th percentile relative to all other academic programs in terms of their earning potential. So
question, Bob,
just fine.
How does bachelor's compare to graduates in terms of direct prep?
It is our belief, there's no data source that actually documents that we found yet. But our belief is there's a much tighter relationship between graduate programs and direct prep, and also probably at the associate's level for your trades programs, some welders and so forth, there's going to be a pretty tight correlation between what the student studies and what they go into. The bachelor's level, all bets are off. Now, one thing about a lot of humanities majors is that they'll end up going to grad school. So you can see lawyers and judges and judicial workers are the largest field history majors go into. Well, they obviously don't go into that straight out of undergrad. Then you've got teaching, 3 or 4 slots in teaching, education administration, and this is one of the ones I think is pretty counterintuitive for most people, chief executives and legislators. And while not my favorite person, I've actually met her a couple times, did a project for her, Carly Fiorina, is also a history graduate, and she's actually checks both those boxes of CEO and legislator. So that is an unusually high representation for a given degree. So there's something about being a history major that is tied to actually ending up as a CEO, though let's not get carried away. There are only 23,000 people in this group. That's not a lot. Retail sales, yep, if you don't make CEO, you're going to end up at Starbucks. It's possible. Management analyst, though, also. We see that first line supervisors retail. Now, remember, too, that this is for folks 30 to 60. So there may be people who are more or less still a little bit starting out in their career, or they may just have not have progressed, that would be filling in these individual jobs at the lower end. And certainly there are history majors who end up at the lower end in terms of pay, but the average is lifted up if you go by a couple of these very high paid professions. Philosophers, I won't go through this in the same detail, same magnitude of error. They only match one thing in NCES to philosophy. And that's a little bit off. There are 468 fields philosophy majors go into versus clergy. But then we get lawyers, again, teachers, interestingly, physicians, managers. And the one that I think is the most counterintuitive, but then once somebody explained it to me, it made great sense, software developers and QA testers. Why is that? Well, it turns out Google hires philosophy majors by choice. I think one of the reasons is that if you study philosophy, you have to take courses in logic. And formal logic, as I like to say, is about the most illogical thing in the world, but it is the way a computer thinks, and, or, not, et cetera. And you can get to some very complex things when you start to work through that. So I think it turns out that while it wouldn't appear that way, that it actually is good training for a lot of different fields, and particularly some of the technical fields as well. English majors, they don't do quite as well. They're down to 50th percentile, primarily because they choose to go into fields that are not as lucrative. But I assume that that's a conscious choice, not something that they're entirely forced into because of their major. Again, you see teaching, manager, other. Law is still big here, but not nearly as big as it was in the other 2 pages. For history, that was 120,000. Writers, of course. And actually, I would say that English majors tend to go into fields which are reasonably aligned with what they do, editors, teaching, and writers. Unfortunately, those all tend to be very low paid fields. So that's where you end up back down around the 50th percentile. So now let's look at some actual employment data for a program. And remember, now we're in one of those fields that is played reasonably well. We're talking about finance. And so, I almost throw it open, but, when you look at the overall size, I think the conclusion is pretty easy. It's all green. And so this is a very big program, 97th and 98th percentile on all 3 of our size metrics. And we use 3: job postings, BLS current employment, pretty reliable number, and BLS annual job openings, not my favorite number, if anybody wants to know the ins and outs, but fundamentally the BLS job openings estimate is built off the BLS forecast. And the forecast is right about 20% of the time. It's better than throwing darts, but really it's only marginally better than throwing darts. So anything that's based on the BLS forecast is suspect. Doesn't mean you shouldn't look at it, but don't rely on it. It's not very good data. So triangulate, make sure that the area that you think is growing is really growing. Talk to local employers, check job postings, but do not use BLS forecasts on their own as a basis for a decision. Now, I want to distinguish between that forecast and BLS current employment. The BLS current employment number is as good a number as you're going to find. It's not an estimate, it's actually a survey. It's very stable data, so their estimates are coming out consistently over time. So the employment number is pretty good. Job openings is based on that forecast, and that forecast is not good. So use both those numbers with great care. Again, you don't have to discard them, but be careful. Now, all that's about direct prep. So when we look down here, we start to add back in all the other fields that they could go into for which they're not directly prepared. And again, you see very large numbers here. Now, the next question is, okay, let's agree that it's big. We're 98th percentile relative to the top 28 programs in the United States out of 1,400. Now let's start to look at what's going on in terms of growth. And let's start with a forecast because it's 0.7%. And if you want to know why we don't really pay much attention to it, it's because the actual growth over the last 3 years is 3.8%, and the historical growth last 1 year is 2.4%. So that 0.7% estimate is off by between 3 and 4 times. So a little bit noisy there. And that's, again, why we're careful with it. Unfortunately, we haven't found a better way yet. We are working on it. We tested looking at the trend, the 3 and 5 year trends, instead of using the forecast. And we found that that was actually about as accurate as the forecast. We were hoping it would be better. So I'd look at both, and we'll be doing some work with machine learning and so forth to try and find a formula that generates a better forecast than that current BLS. Now, the next number that's I think is really interesting, and this is probably the best indicator of whether jobs for your graduates, is job postings per graduate. So in this case, it's 3.9. That's at about the 70th percentile, which is good. It's not fabulous, but it's good. Again, the BLS job openings per graduate is subject to all the issues I just mentioned. The next thing you want to look at is wages. And if we're looking at BLS, they look good, not great, above average. But when you look at ACS, where we actually ask the person what they did, or the American Community Survey does, you see them coming out more in the 90s. So 94th percentile wages under 30 and 93rd percentile wages over 30, making $137,000, $138,000 a year. I don't think that's any surprise to those of us who've been around finance a little bit. There's ever been a field that was overpaid, this is probably it, but it is. And it's, honestly, these wages are not high for finance. So it's not hard to find a job in finance paying $400,000 or $500,000 a year. A couple of other things here. You can look at this sheet and understand if people get graduate degrees. So 32% of the folks in finance have a graduate degree. And I'm going to surmise that's primarily MBAs, perhaps with majors in finance in there as well, and probably some other graduate degrees, statistics and things like that. Of the people who go on to graduate school, 26% of all students with a 26% of all people with in this field have a master's degree. So most of that graduate work is done at the master's level, and we have a handful with doctorates. Now, unemployment, this is another really important metric, I think. If the unemployment rate for that group is below the national average, that's a bad sign for the job relevance of that degree. In this case, it's about in line with the national average, 2 and 3%. And then one of the other numbers here is, what percentage of these students go into direct prep fields? In this case, it's 39%, which is actually pretty high, the statistics I just mentioned. So you can look at this and say, chances are the people who study finance are going to go into finance more often than do anything else. By the way, still only 39%.
Hey, Bob, real quickly, a question. Is the BLS data more, the projections more accurate for career technical degrees?
I don't think so. I've looked at it for auto in particular. We used to do a lot of work in auto tech. And this is a number of years ago. The actual number of jobs for auto techs right now is growing. Job postings are up. It's very healthy. But in the early 2000s, we were looking at the forecasts and the actuals. And what we found was every year, BLS forecast growth in demand for auto techs. And then the next year it did a forecast, you would see a step down of 5% of a decline in the number of auto techs, and another projection over the next 10 years of growth. This is like five predictions in a row where the actual number in the field fell and BLS persisted in projecting growth. So no, I wouldn't say it's any better in the trades than it is anyplace else. Haven't specifically checked that, but the instances that I've seen, it's not. Let's recognize, though, I shouldn't be so critical of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It is truly a heroic effort to do any kind of forecast for 700 occupations, 10 years out, right? In the United States, where the economy could go up or down by 3 to 5% in a year, we've had pandemics, we have the Great Recession in the last 15 years. This is a very dynamic economy we live in, with not only those macro changes, but all sorts of micro changes in what's hot. AI in 2010 essentially didn't exist in any broad way. But then with the advent of people using graphical processor units instead of the classical CPU, all of a sudden it became feasible to do machine learning models on a PC, and the field began to explode. So there's just a lot of stuff going on that's very difficult to predict. So as I say, we'll try and do better. I am skeptical it will be successful, but I think it's worth trying. It's a very hard task to predict what's going to happen in the economy. So what is actually happening out there? First, job postings. This is not news to anybody who's been reading the papers or watching TV. There is just a boom in jobs out there. So while will there be a job really was the concern of the last 10 or 15 years, I think that's going to change now that we're going into an economy where employers are almost literally desperate in many cases for people to come to work. And I think that's going to make the work environment better. Remote work is going to be an option in more and more cases. And people are going to treat you better because they need you, and they're going to pay you better because they need you. So again, I think that'll open up an opportunity for colleges. I don't think that direct prep concept will fade too much in the sense that students are still going to be concerned, if I get this degree, what job do I have? But I think that's likely to decline a little bit over the next few years, as any warm body is going to get a job. So, and in fact, it might create a problem for colleges, especially at the community college level, where folks can go out without a degree and get a job. So that'll take students, if you will, out of the population that might be interested in getting a degree, whether that's, I think it'll be particularly at the community college level, where they may be studying to be at trades. And what's happening now in auto tech again is the auto techs are getting hired before they're finished with school. So it's a mixed bag for higher ed, but I think also an opportunity in a way to step back a little bit from this whole pressure on tightly aligning every academic program with a field. It's not really how humans work, and it's not great for the academic environment. Now, this is my Christmas tree chart. We got a red and green out a little bit prematurely this year, but I wanted to try and use the colors to summarize what's going on in terms of job posting volume. So green are tax and finance folks. Well, we're doing this particular measurement in March to February of 2022. So we're ending in tax season, and that's causing a lot of volume here in tax professionals. You can see 1, 2, 3 tax fields here on this chart. The next thing, and it's far larger, is healthcare. And 7 of these 16 bars are actually healthcare. And you can see it, again, always registered nurse, but medical assistant is booming, phlebotomists, patient care techs, LPNs, that's a lower level nurse, certified nursing assistant, and pharmacist. So if you want the short version of what's hot, it really is all about healthcare right now in terms of what's growing. The next thing you see is software, and that's the blue lines. And we've got 3 software fields in the top 15. And then there's sort of a random smattering of other things. Project managers, very likely many of those are associated with software. Direct support professional and auto tech, as I mentioned a minute ago, there is a boom in demand for auto techs right now. That wasn't true when it was being predicted by BLS when I was looking at it 10, 12 years ago. Now, what are the fastest growing jobs? Again, tax. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these that are all in healthcare, different flavors of nurses, primarily RN, a registered nurse, medical, surgical. So they're going to be in the operating room with you, the intensive care nurse, and a licensed practical nurse, primarily going to be working in nursing homes. Then we have speech pathologist, phlebotomist, again, not only large, but growing, and just plain old registered nurse, not only large over here with 55,000, but growing at 100% in terms of job postings. So it is literally true that people are desperate. When we look at this, the number of job postings here, you're looking at a very substantial portion of the entire nursing population that's, now open for hire. So interestingly, auto techs over here at 205% growth. So there is a shortage there, as well as a large field. Again, program coordinator, vet tech. Now, interesting trades level program. The problem with this one is just the wages are terrible and there's really no career path. But very popular. There are a lot of people who want to go in and work with animals. And as long as they can afford it, it's an interesting program and there is demand. Of course, we got tax here, not surprising. And a little bit of software, not as much as I would have expected, frankly. Software engineer and software development engineer, both on the chart. And to wrap it up, our finance guys made it onto the chart as well. So there's rapidly growing demand for the folks we're talking about here in terms of people with a finance background. So we've talked about student demand, we've talked about employment. Now there's another thing you got to worry about, which is competition. And this is an example of kind of data we would suggest you pull together on competition. How many campuses are out there? In this case, 32. That puts it at the 97th percentile in this particular market. So it's a pretty competitive program. But campuses, number of campuses out there actually went down by 2. So the competition is declining in this space, which is a positive thing. But still 14 with in-market online students. So these are schools offering online programs that are out of state, but still pulling out of that market. I think we're the only people that really keep track of that. So average completions is a good number to understand, is this likely to be a big program if I offered it? Or am I performing above or below average in terms of completions? Watch out for this though, because if there's one big player, it can screw up the average. And that's really what we're seeing here. When you see the divergence we have between the average number and the median number, the middle school here at the middle of the pack, the one that's, out of 100 programs at 50, is only got 11 completions. So this isn't usually a very large program. Somebody out there though is really going through the roof with it and driving this number up. The year-over-year median program completions are going down, and it's really very slightly. But this is literally such a small fraction that the units shows a 0 because they're being rounded off, but it's only being divided by 11. So we're getting a large percentage change, very small, almost negligible unit change. Still, though, declining median is not good. That means that the people who already have programs are having a little bit of trouble filling their seats. So I always view that as a warning sign. Then we look at these in-market saturation numbers, and none of them are favorable. This is a case where a high number is not good. And we can see the Google Competition Index at 0.52. That's actually a number Google provides. It ranges from 0 to 1. That's getting up above average, 78th percentile in our data. Cost per click is at the 83rd percentile, so it's getting to be quite expensive. And cost per inquiry is at the 92nd percentile. So all these numbers tell you is how intense is the competition in this market for this program. As an example, Google cost per click goes up when there's more competition and people bid higher for those clicks. And that's actually getting to be pretty expensive. If you think about it, at best, 1 in 100, 1 in 200 maybe, clicks are going to turn into an actual student. So in order to understand what the impact is of $22 in terms of the cost to recruit a student, that's going to be somewhere between $2,200 and, $2,200 and $4,400 per student if we have a $22 cost per click. So that's getting to be a pretty high number. And then we have to look and say, has this gone online? Interesting, it really hasn't. There are 72 institutions, that's 9% of institutions, but only 4% of completion. So it's actually underrepresented given the number of institutions. So for some reason, this isn't taking off online. And by the way, COVID accepted, when everybody was online, this is the people who've signed up specifically for programs that are and will be online indefinitely. So while we had very good numbers that would have suggested starting this program in student demand, we had very good numbers in employment that would have suggested starting it. These numbers say, gotta really stand back and think about this. I may be too late, and it will be difficult to grow this program because the competition is very intense. I will say, many of you out there, remember competition is intense in everything. So either you're going to be good at competing, you're going to be good at marketing, good at admissions, or you're going to have a problem. So in that sense, competition shouldn't scare you away. But on the other hand, this is pretty intense. So this wouldn't be my first choice of a new program to launch unless I was really good at going in and taking share from other people. So that's really the mantra for if you want to grow, honestly, is you've got to figure out how to win share from other people. Because if you think about the overall enrollment numbers declining, the only way for you to grow is to take a student that somebody else would have gotten. So scorecard. Now, last section we mentioned is degree fit. Not going to spend a lot of time here. This is primarily a bachelor's program. We can see by completions, 90% of completions nationally are at the bachelor's level. In market, it's 82, and inquiries are also in the 90s. So it's pretty much a bachelor's program. A little bit of population here at the master's level, but not a lot, and almost nothing at the doctoral level. Workforce, who's actually doing these jobs, 47% bachelor's, 20% master's, and a smattering of doctoral. So, we're looking at 67% in this bachelor's and master's range, and a smattering of degrees or lack of degrees below that. So I'm not going to walk through this. You've really been through each of the elements of this. But what we try to do is put the whole scorecard, all the data on one page, so a decision maker has it there and can make this decision with the data in front of them and not have to go hunting through 50 papers and ask you to go back and redo your homework and bring back something else. And so that's really the concept of doing it on one page. I know it's a lot on a page, But I think the trade-off when you're trying to make these decisions between dense page information and hunting through dozens of documents makes the one-page view very, very helpful. And so that's what we call a program scorecard. And finance here is actually overall one of the highest scoring programs in California. And again, this isn't something where you can make a decision purely based on a number like that. When I look at competition, it really gives me pause here. So even though student demand and employment are really great, I'd worry about that pink box there down on competition and make sure I've got a clear plan for how I'm going to win in this market if I choose to offer this program. Now let's talk about economics. Economics is really pretty simple conceptually in higher ed. It's not so simple to put the data together. But the first thing you have to deal with is people in higher education don't worry about margins because they generally believe that that's not really the point of a higher education institution. I'm oversimplifying. They're not here to make a profit, except for the small number of you who are in for-profit institutions. That's just generally not the case. But margins are still very important because margins allow you to pay for mission. They allow you to pay for academic programs that aren't ever going to make money. You know, if you're a religious school and you offer a course in ministry or gospel, very unlikely that program's going to make money. In fact, it may well lose it, and it'll probably, in many cases, be very small. So you need another program that's producing enough margin to subsidize that. And in higher education, cross subsidies across programs are not evil. They're actually the heart of the purpose of generating margin, which is to make sure that you can fund your mission, even those things which are intrinsically unprofitable to do. We advocate, when you're doing program analysis, to start with direct instructional economics. That is revenue minus instructional cost. That does not include all kinds of overheads. It's not that you should never include them, but when you're making program decisions, those numbers, the allocations, the president's salary, they just aren't going to change. And when you're making the decision, you don't want to be confused and thinking to save all this money in your indirect costs when you cut a program, and then look up and find out that actually the savings was a fraction of that because none of the upstream costs, the overhead, the fixed costs changed when you cut your program, or for that matter, went up when you added one. So we tend to focus on this number when we're making program decisions. There are other kinds of decisions where you'd want to include the full cost, but when you're making a program decision, you want to focus on the revenue, cost, and margin that are likely to change because of that program decision. So I mentioned revenue. Several buckets here that you want to keep in mind. We want to think about the tuition the student actually was charged, the rack rate tuition, the fees that they have been charged, and any other revenue that you may be getting from that student. Now, if you're a public institution, you also want to add in any per student funding you get from the state as part of the revenue per student. Now, there's also funding that's fixed. It's not per student, and that we would not include in program margins. It would go in and get to offset your overheads. Then you subtract from that institutional grants. That would be things like scholarships. Now, and that'll get you net revenue. Now, remember that Pell Grants are not institutional, they're governmental. So that's going to flow into you as revenue, as tuition. So you don't want to subtract, governments, you don't want to subtract foundations that may be funding a student and so forth when you're doing these numbers, but you do want to take out the money in effect that your institution discounted in order to get that student in the door. Now, we've had discussions with folks who said, well, we really should just use the average discount. This data is disguised as is all the institutional data we're looking at today. But when you look at this kind of variability by program, and this is real in terms of amount of variation, you just can't ignore it. I mean, there's some of these programs that are giving out $350 per student credit hour in discounts, others where it's zero. And so if you average this out, you're really distorting the actual economics of your programs. And it's really important here. Why would that be true? Well, people tend to cluster in certain programs. So for example, your athletes may cluster in a group of programs. And so you want to be able to see what your net price is for the students who are actually in that program. Instructional cost per section is really your faculty. Generally, there might be some small amount of non-personnel cost, but it's going to be faculty salary and benefits. Now, importantly, faculty do more than teach. So before you just take the whole wages and benefits for a faculty member and allocate them to teaching or assign them to teaching, you actually have to take out the non-teaching time. There are many ways to do that. Faculty load tables are one where the faculty's been assigned to do, let's assume they have to do 12 credit to be a full load, and they're only doing 9 because they've got 3 credit hours elsewhere. Well, then you want to take a quarter of their pay, that 3 credit hours, and take it out of instructional costs, because that's not what they're doing. There's another way to do that, which is what I call a groundhog method. If a full-time instructor could teach 12 credits, well, the groundhog literally is if a faculty member could teach 12, could teach only credits, how many credits would a faculty member teach? Well, let's say it's 12. If they're only teaching 9, again, you take 25% and take it out of instructional cost. And then you want to move it down to the actual program, the courses and sections that faculty members teaching based on the number of credit hours in the course, the course credit hours in that course. So if they're teaching 9, you've got 75% of their pay that's going to get allocated out based on credit hours to each of the courses they're taking based on the number of credit hours in that course. Then you're just going to spread that cost to the individual students in that course, regardless of their major. You're going to divide it by the total number of students and assign that instructional cost to the individual students in that class. And then that cost is going to follow them back into their major. So when you think about this, the revenue and cost for a nursing student taking English is not going to flow up to the English department in a programmatic view. It's going to flow over and into the nursing department. Now, when we do this, we also have a button to press where you can come back and look at it by department. It's not wrong to look at things by department. It's just not as accurate a way of looking at it when you're making program decisions. When you're making staffing choices, oftentimes you want to be looking at departmental numbers. So in our systems, we allow you to look at both. And then I think one of the most important things here is to do clear visual math so that, you got people in your faculty who haven't done math since high school and probably didn't like it then. So give them a visual they can easily understand. And with all the competition for our time and attention, anything that makes it easy to understand is useful for everybody. So gross tuition and fees here, you can see it walking down discounts. That gets us to net revenue minus instructional costs. Now I'm at program contribution. And that is the amount of money that the program is generating to cover my departmental and institutional overheads. Now you can go ahead and allocate those out further if you want to, and there may be reasons to do that. And this is just an example. You can see it walking down to $40 so that by the time you get out of the department level, you've only got $40 of margin left. And that's got to cover all your institutional overheads. And you can see admissions and marketing, other revenue offsetting a little bit of this. And then institutional overhead drops us $30, and we're down to a $5 institutional surplus on that original program margin. If you want a rule of thumb that may be helpful to you and save you a lot of time doing allocations, what I would say is you have to have about 3 times as much margin as you have cost in order to break even on a program. 66% overhead is not an unusual number. You'll want to look at that for your own institution. And oftentimes that's easier to tell a faculty than we went through all these allocations and, you really didn't make money after all. The allocation, you'll just get in a long argument that way. And it's kind of pointless. But so I would just say, look, come up with a number for your institution that's right, that for us to break even, a program has to generate this much contribution relative to its cost. Everybody can do that math and understand what the target is. Now, when you're done with that analysis, there is a surprise. You've heard probably your president, the board members say, we got to get rid of these small programs, they lose money. State legislatures do this, and some states even have rules that you can only continue a program that has more than a certain number of graduates. Unfortunately, that has very little to do with reality in terms of what makes money and what does not. If you look at this chart down here towards really very few student credit hours, we still got most of the dots above 0. So what happens when you cut programs typically is your revenue will fall as fast or faster than your cost. So you're actually not going to save very much. So yes, there are a few here, and you got to sort of take a look and make sure that things that are not being, there's no attendance and your margins are negative. We'll come up with, I'll show you in a moment, a better structure. Yeah, you have to look at them, but don't expect to find a lot of money there. They're small. They're not consuming a lot of resources in most cases. Now, if you want to know what doesn't absorb resources or generate them, here's an interesting chart. It had a lot of surprises for me. So first thing you need to understand, even though I put some of the bars in red here, all of these programs have positive contribution margin. There's a question about what's the definition of a small program, FTE numbers. That really is a judgment call, and it depends on the size of the institution. If you got 20,000 students in a program with 15 students in it across 4 years, that's pretty small. It also tends to lead to a mediocre or bad student experience because you have no peers to work with. I was actually in a language program at my college, and my freshman year, I was in the highest level of the language because I'd lived in the country for a while. So, I ended up, doing something else because I just didn't feel like the department had either the student count or really the course levels for me to continue that as a area of focus. I did take some more courses, but so what you see here are the margins on, the difference in margin. And so at the top, we've got art teacher education, which is 60% higher margin than the average program. The next bar down, health allied services, also very high margin, 50%, more than 50% higher than average. And then you get to some things that surprise me. Everybody talks about registered nursing as being a very expensive program, and it may well be expensive, but notice that it's 40% higher than average margin. So the way nursing is run actually makes it a high margin program, and I suspect that's because the classes run full. There are not a lot of choices you can have in your nursing program, so you haven't diffused nursing students across a wide selection of courses, so class sizes are still pretty healthy. Psych is good. I was a little disappointed to see my history major there, almost 10% below average. I think people think of history as, a place where you're going to, have all your gen eds. English, the same thing, that you would have thought that would be a high margin major, and it's not. And Spanish actually dragging up the back here, and drama and theater arts, which is almost always one of the most expensive programs that a school will offer, oftentimes actually losing money. So you need to know these numbers for your own institution and be able to understand what's high and not and why. So for example, if you look at history, in English, their service programs. So the English department may be very contribution positive because students across the university have to take that course. And when you do the revenue, cost, and margin by student, in a departmental cut, it'll look great because I've got all kinds of students from other parts of the institution taking low-level courses in large classes. But when you get a little bit, if you're majoring in English, then you also are going to take a lot of relatively small programs, courses and sections at higher levels. So while the English department is probably above average in terms of its economics, the English program is a little bit below average. So keep that in mind. Department and program are very different cuts of the world. Let's see, comparing.
Just a quick message for everybody.
Yep.
I'm gonna, I'm not ignoring you. We are running close to our time. We only have about 13 minutes left. That's why I'm not interrupting Bob in terms of questions, just so you guys all know.
If we don't get to them verbally, we'll capture them and I'll get back to you in writing after our webinar. But I'm probably going to have time, but I am going to pick up the pace a little here. So comparing course level economics across departments is interesting. Here we're looking at cost per student credit hour. But when you do this, you're going to get all sorts of pushback that, the cost per student credit hour is intrinsically higher for this program versus that program. And it's actually true. It is. You're teaching music and giving one-on-one lessons on an instrument. That's going to be very high cost. Doesn't matter what institution you look at, it's high cost. So you will get that pushback. And so interdepartmental comparisons on cost aren't really very effective. If you look within a department, you start to be able to get a more reliable understanding of relative cost, but you'll still have issues within a department because the courses in a department are not apples to apples. The intro to music program should be very high margin, low cost per student credit hour. But again, you get back to individual instruction on an instrument and it's going to be very expensive. So even though they're in the same department, all those costs are not necessarily comparable. We're getting closer. What you really need is external benchmarks at a detailed level. So here we're showing, again, an example, but because we do program economics with schools, those schools who choose to share their data get benchmark data back that's extremely granular. We can get down to the course subject and course level detail. So you can see a Theater 101 at this school is much more expensive than normal. The red dots are the client. The blue bars are the benchmark. They're ahead on Intro to Gender Studies in terms of benchmark, but now we're really talking apples to apples. So it's worth a much deeper discussion with this data with your faculty to say, okay, why are we out of whack? Have we got too many courses, so we're scattering our students and running down our class sizes? Are we having too many sections? And really try and get to the bottom of the cost drivers and try and figure out how to drive margins up. Remember, when you're trying to improve cost, you're going to do that at the course level, though. It's not really going to be a program issue. It's all about class size. And faculty utilization is the other dimension. So when you get to the end of this and you want to think about your program portfolio, what we've got here is, I think, a very helpful graphical display. No program names on it, but the darkest color here is mission critical. The medium is mission aligned, and the reds are discretionary. That's not a good, better, best. It's just that some things are closer to your mission than others. And you begin to worry about a red bubble up here where it's really not on mission. It's it's discretionary, could or couldn't. I remember one of my colleagues talking about, they had a program at Stanford in athletic training or something like that. They really didn't feel, I don't remember the real program, by the way, didn't feel it was tightly aligned with Stanford's mission, but it was big and it was growing. They finally capped it, even though it was making money, because they felt that that they could only afford so much dilution of mission in their academic programs. So they just said it's only going to be this big. And now let's contrast two programs here. I've got one down here in the bottom right that's black, so it's very mission critical. And I've got a red dot here right about 0 on the y-axis. So it's about 0 in terms of contribution, but it's discretionary. And you might think, well, this one's losing more money, let's get rid of it. I don't really think that's the right answer for two reasons. One, this x-axis is the attractiveness of the market. So this program is actually in a very good market. Whenever I see a program underperforming in a healthy market, my first instinct is to say, well, that probably can be improved, and we can move that black dot up from down there up into the mid-range by doing something in marketing or the way we're administering the program. Hard to say what the problem is there, but it's not the market because it's getting a very high market score. So there's an opportunity there for improvement. Even if we don't improve it, though, that's a mission critical program, so we're probably going to keep it no matter what. This red dot over here hovering around 0 in a lousy market, 20th percentile market, that's a whole different discussion. And that's one of the programs you probably want to look at. It's relatively small. It doesn't make money. It's in a weak market. You really have to have the discussion of why are we offering this? Again, in stark contrast, there's one right next to it, which is dark and mission critical. You're going to keep that because it's important to your institution. Now let's talk about the decision-making process and kind of how you do this, not what the analytics are. First thing you got to do is define program evaluation. What are you actually going to do? I think that the dimensions are pretty inflexible: market, margins, academics, and mission. But not every institution needs to look at every dimension of decision, whether it's start, stop, sustain, or grow. I've done a lot of work with institutions who recognized that they weren't going to save a lot of money at the program level by cutting programs, and really just worked on start, sustain, and grow. I've had schools that really only wanted to look at start. So one of the things you want to do at the outset is define the scope of the program evaluation you're going to do. And it takes some of the angst out of the process if you don't include stop. But if you need to cut costs, you probably do need to look at that. You're not going to find a lot, but you will find some where you really, your judgment will tell you really have to make the tough choice and shut them down. And you do need to make sure whatever you're doing will lead to a sustainable portfolio. And I want to make a distinction between evaluation and assessment. Evaluation is about whether to offer that program or not, whether to grow it. And assessment is, I've got the program, how do I make it better? And so I think of those as two different things. And assessment is going to have much more to do with the academic content of the program and less to do with the kind of market factors that I'm talking about. And that a fundamental question of, the question of, how vital is that program in a marketplace, and should we stop or grow it? The first thing you got to do when you're going through the process is actually get your people up to speed. So we've set the table here. We've said this is what we're trying to do with our program evaluation. Now I've got to, get them up to speed. And so we would suggest a couple of ways. Plug my book. Start, Stop, or Grow is coming out in May. If you'd like to pre-order a copy, you can do that. Go to robertgrayatkins.com. That's robertgrayatkins.com and sign up. I'm hoping to make this into a bestseller, and I'm almost certainly going to be disappointed. But I think it's about 95, 100 pages. So it's a pretty succinct summary of how to go about doing this work. And it'll give you a nice recap of what we've talked about today, as well as some more depth. If you're going to be really involved in this, you're going to be one of the leaders of a program evaluation effort, I would suggest you go to the course as well. And we do that in conjunction with Baypath. The price is $775. If you're a client and so forth, talk to us if you need a discount on that. We'll probably do it with you. But it's a really good course with 6 to 10 hours of material for you. And instructors, yours truly, Dr. Morris Olson, who's really done a wonderful job around program innovation, Bill Massey, the ex-CFO at Stanford, as well as head of their business school, and several of my partners are involved as well. Now, we've set the scope, we've had our people have a chance to get up to speed. Now you got to include the right people. And it's a very broad list of people, and you really want to be looking at a meeting that we're going to talk about in a moment that's got 30 to 50 people in it. So you need those in the room so that you can get that kind of comfort and support and participation and sense of being heard that will otherwise come back and hurt you if you haven't done it up front. So academic leaders are important here, the provost and assistant provost, deans, chairs, and I would include the president of the faculty senate. If you're unionized, I would also include some of the union leaders in the room. Institutional leaders, generally speaking, the president isn't in the room for the process. They'll be reported out to, and it's helpful if they can come in as we talk about the workshop and kind of be a bookend and kick it off and emphasize the importance of the effort and the time people are putting in, and then come back at the end to hear what they recommend. Then you get to other people on the institutional side, the CFO or somebody from finance, marketing, admissions, student services, and I mentioned the union leader. Institutional research should also be there. Much of the data that we're going to share, that you share in a workshop, they'll have comments on, they'll understand, and they can answer some detailed questions for you as you go through the process. What is the process, the core? It's a 2-day workshop. Day 1, everybody gets brought up to speed on the data and how to evaluate it. And then they have some fun in the afternoon and go out and look for new programs that have high scores in the market. They rank high. They tee up their favorite ideas and go looking for data on those in the system. And they come back and they read out and they recommend each of typically around 4 or 5 small groups will recommend new programs. And then you go through and prioritize those to try and find, I think around 10 is usually a good number of programs that will come out of this that are preliminary recommendations that you are going to have to further evaluate and consider. Just at a basic level, you're going to have a board and you're going to have to run financials for some of these things. So you're not going to be end of job on day 1 or day 2 with recommendations, but you'll have really narrowed the field down and you'll know why you've narrowed it down to that. And everybody in the room will know that. And if they objected, they've had a chance to be heard. So again, very important there. And I will say that we have a process where anybody who's got a concern can just raise their hand and we'll literally stop the meeting to hear their concerns. And that gets people to the point where they feel like it's at least an honest process, though they may not agree with everything that came out of it. And importantly, we often find that somebody who has a concern will sway the entire group. That usually happens about once in one of these workshops where a single person and their concerns will describe something about a program that makes it back on the grow list or describe something that changes one of the other decisions. So it's very important to run an honest process in this because you can't always make people comfortable that that you made the right decision, but oftentimes they'll be comfortable because they feel the process was objective and honest. And the second day, you look at your current programs. By now, people understand what a good program looks like, and they're able to evaluate their own programs objectively. To complete the process, you have your own internal rules. You're going to have to do a business plan. You're going to have to get faculty approval. And ultimately, you may be up in front of management, the board, the state, your creditors. So it can be a very time-consuming process. As part of that, you're going to want to organize teams for a program. This is a team effort to be successful. You need to include faculty, admissions, marketing, and others in order to do this well. And that team will stay on for the programs that are approved and help to implement them. one of the errors you can make here is getting your academics together, deciding on a program, building a program, and then the day you want to launch it, you go over to marketing and say, hey guys, I got a new program for you. It doesn't work, and you'll end up really getting hurt. And some programs like nursing, you really have to go through, you need specific training on that program for your admissions reps. It can take months to do, and to get it set up so you can even route, an applicant into the right admissions person. Program launches, I really covered the main thing here, which is to make sure that you've got the right team together to represent the institution. Last but not least, you can't do this once and walk away. You really need a regular process that looks at all your programs for certain variables like market indicators. Is student demand going up or down? That can be very volatile. That's not going to make you decide to stop a program, but it might make you pause and say, wait a second, we've got too many sections assigned to this in the fall. Given this fall off we're seeing in the marketplace, then you might want to look at your funnel and see how many applicants you have that are interested in that and so forth. So quarterly reviews for things that are volatile, annual reviews for things like student outcomes, and then finally, biannually, you can look at the actual academic content. Now, to help you with all of that, we provide a program dashboard that pulls all this together. And it looks at the status of all 4 categories. It allows you to look at summary data on markets, summary data on margins. On the right-hand side, you have a bunch of academic indicators like DFW rates and number of completions and number of students. So it summarizes all the critical data about that about the program on a page. And of course, you can click through the systems that drive that. Now, most important in the middle of this is qualitative information the faculty fills in to say, what are the goals for improvement for this program? And then align how this program aligns with the mission. And when you go to get for your accreditation reviews, below this, there's a detail on the particular actions that you're going to take, what the status of those actions is. And you can actually roll this back 5 years and say, okay, here's where we started. Here are the actions we took. Here's where we ended. It's all there. It's all documented. And it's very well received by accreditation as a result.
Hey, Bob, one quick question I think is pretty relevant.
Yep.
Have you put the program economics into a self-service dashboard?
Yes, we have. So you can see that and cut it any way you want, down to the individual sections within courses within that program. And here we have the busiest chart. I think this wins the record for the busiest chart at Gray. But what we're trying to do is put all the key metrics for your programs on a page. And in the live system, you can sort. So if you wanted to see the programs with the fastest growth there, of course, you can spot them in the green on this particular screen, where the Google volumes are way up, 40% up. And that's what I mean. If I saw that, I'd want to have a look, check what's happening in my funnel. Am I taking advantage of that growth? And second, am I ready for it if it comes into my campus? And then over here, you can see all your critical academic metrics. And finally, the benchmark numbers of your relative cost relative to benchmark for the programs where we have comparators. And believe it or not, that's it. So please come back and join us for the next installments on curricular efficiency, predictive analytics, and the future of program portfolio evaluation and management. And all of this material will be available to you on the web. You can download the whole thing if you have the patience to watch it again, but of course you'll also be able to download the charts themselves. So now I can take it. I'm happy to stay on a few more minutes if anybody would like to, but you've been here a long time, so I wouldn't be at all surprised if you want to check out. But as I say, anybody who'd like to stay on a few more minutes, I'm happy to take a few questions. And a link for the slide deck, Ned. Do you have that? No, we haven't posted it yet. So Ken, we'll get back to you on that shortly.
Just so everybody knows, we edit this a little bit, and usually you will receive an email with the deck as well as it'll be a website link with the deck to download as well as the recording. And we will continue to keep posting the next deck as well as the recording on that webpage. So you will have them all in one place.
Don't forget the book for those of you who are still here. And again, I don't know if you'll open mics or if anybody, again, I'd use the chat or the Q&A and I'll be glad to get to you. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. I don't see any questions coming through, so thank you all very much. Really appreciate the time. And yes, you will get the link to the materials in an email because you've attended today. And by the way, if someone hasn't attended and they're a colleague and they want to download it, as long as they signed up for the workshop, they'll be able to get it.
Yep.
Cost for additional material, Ken, what are you thinking of? The book, the course, this presentation, our systems? Ken, if you can give me a little more detail, where do we go to buy the book? If you could, Ned, could you post that?
Yep. Give me 1 second.
Yep, Robert.
Just sorry about this. The book is in production. We will have a pre-order available very soon, but I'm going to give you the link to Bob's website where you can sign up for more information.
Yeah, and the link is robertgrayatkins.com.
I'll throw it right in the chat.
I'm not that pretentious. If you wonder why I used all three of my names, it's actually because if you put in Robert Atkins, you get the Diet Doctor, and I'll be on page 30. So in order to have a unique URL, I went to robertgrayatkins.com. Ken, I'm still hoping you can tell me what you're looking for. Not sure, the book is going to be around, I think, $30. The course is $7.95. This deck, if you want to download this in the recording, obviously is free. Our consulting services and the dashboards and so forth, the price depends on the institution size.
Ken, I will definitely have somebody from our team reach out to you, and we can definitely walk you through a lot of this stuff for Loma Linda.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I'm going to sign off and look forward to talking with you all again on one of our next webinars.